Distortion, reverb, feedback, and static. For most musicians and other forms of music, these are basically side effects for them that they have to deal with that they can even use to their advantage whenever they create their own forms of music in their respected fields. However, in noise, these are basically the main ingredients as to what makes this style of music something really unique in its own right. Noise music has always fascinated me, not just for its abstract concept that basically goes against the rule books of music all the time, but it really has to do with just the challenging nature of it all. By having just a basic understanding of this style of music, it's very apparent that this is definitely not for everyone, but I do feel like as to what is its overall selling point and as to why people invest with it, is that because of its abstract nature that will always be attached with the style of noise, you'll either come across albums that are so unorthodox and against the grain that it really tests your overall understanding of what music can create sonically, or you come across albums that are so vicious, perverse, and vile that it really transcends your understanding of what disturbing music is. But before I get into talking about the albums to get you into noise, I want to deviate for a sec and actually discuss the origins and history of noise music. Because for the longest time, I always thought the origins for it came around the late 70s and early 80s when, I believe, Throbbing Gristle came around in the late 70s and they introduced to the world industrial music. And noise was kind of like a spawn off of it in the early 80s when groups like Whitehouse were popping through. But that's actually not the case when it comes to the origins of noise, because the real origin actually spawned all the way back roughly around a little over a century ago in Italy. The individual in question that started it would be Luigi Russolo, who was an Italian futurist who believed that with the Industrial Revolution that was happening around the world in the early 20th century, that the audience wouldn't be so interested in the conventional means of music, and thought because of the noises and sounds that would come from industrialization, he wanted to bring that concept over onto music. And around the years of 1913 and 14, he basically created noise orchestras for the audience. For the individuals that attended Luigi Russolo's shows, they would get the experience of hearing his own instruments that he created himself called intonora moris. These instruments were large and bulky in size, and they would recreate the sounds essentially of the Industrial Revolution that was very abrasive and obnoxious, and as you would expect, it didn't really hit well with audiences whenever he played shows. Thus, for his time, he was viewed as an artistic failure. Yet, all of these decades later, Luigi Russolo has become now this historical figure for noise music history. That yes, you could credit documentation and the internet for kind of like his spotlight into this subject matter. I still feel like it's important to at least discuss the origins of it and the importance of, people from the past having the ambition to at least challenge and kind of break the rule book of their time. So while, again, yes, his approach is very different to what I guess you could call modern day noise, if that's even such a term, I still feel like credit is due for Luigi Russolo's overall involvement with it. With all the time that's passed since then, there's a whole other dimension basically of noise albums and noise artists to listen to that becomes really intimidating at first. Just by the synopsis of it, noise is essentially anything but accessible. Thus, I feel like if you look at the wrong areas of it, you can get immediately turned off by it in a moment's notice. Thus, when it comes to talking about albums to help someone get into noise music, I would either recommend albums that are essential because of the impact in history they have on this style of music, or the very small handful that I would consider to be accessible because they're easier to follow along with and have some of the, I guess, musical norms that you would be accustomed to hearing in music that makes things a bit more familiar. Hence why I always find myself talking about Prurient whenever this conversation is brought up. Now, Prurient is the alias to that of Dominic Furno, which is a very prolific individual when you look at his body of work that he's done with a wide range of musical styles that he's played around with. Obviously with Prurient it would be noise, but other projects like Vatican Shadow that has a mixture of industrial and techno, which is some really interesting stuff that I would recommend just overall for individuals who enjoy either style of those genres, to even black metal, as I believe he's part of a band called Ashpool for a little bit that even did a split with the Kitsa. But Prurient is the project that he's mainly known for because most of his work stems from it. And when you pay attention to the discography of Prurient around the late 2000s to early 2010s, you'll notice now that there's a lot more accessibility from it, mainly having to do with the fact that he plays around, yes, with noise, but he's not afraid to experiment with other forms of music, which again makes it a bit more familiar on the ears for newcomers. And when you take into account arguably his most critically acclaimed album to date, Frozen Niagara Falls, for a lot of people this is considered to be one of the most accessible noise albums really you can find, because even though this album runs for 90 minutes long, it's quite the odyssey of a listen. You'll notice now that there's forms of music such as industrial, ambient, dark wave, no wave, and forms of acoustic instrumentation that kind of like is laced together with the noise, that it becomes a lot more rhythmic and easy to follow along with. Thus, I would argue if you're trying to get even like the slightest grasp of noise music overall, this is arguably the best place to start with. And if this album appeals to you, then I would strongly recommend my personal favorite Prurient album, that being Pleasure Grounds, because Dominic Furno really showcases the power of feedback with composition on it, because the ambience that bounces off is just so mesmerizing, which I didn't think beforehand it was even possible. But this opened up a whole new world for me, this album, which is I guess why I have such an attachment and fondness with it. And even Dominic's vocal performance, as powerful, vicious, and tortured as he sounds, what's just so captivating about it is not only just the powerful composition of ambience that just, again, will engulf you, but Dominic's vocal performance is so emotive, not just for noise standards, but music as a whole. And I would state that, yeah, this is arguably, for my personal taste, his best work. If you're feeling more adventurous and you want to get into the deep end in the Prurient discography, then I would strongly recommend what is considered to be by some as the fan favorite, Cocaine Death, which you're going to notice now this album's a lot more assertive and aggressive, because there is the slightest slither of rhythm in all of it, but it'll be so disorienting hearing just the pulsating noises and static bounce off everything. And Dominic's vocal performance, as just savage as it is with any other album, just feels as if a lot more punchy, like he's really trying to, again, destroy your senses, not only with his vocal approach, but just every little decibel of noise you'll hear off of it. And if this doesn't satisfy your craving for just unhinged noise, at least in the Prurient discography, then go to the deepest part and then listen to The History of AIDS, because this is easily the most unhinged you will find Prurient's overall approach. Now, obviously, I'm not going to just sit here and name every Prurient album. There's a whole other plethora of noise artists to talk about, and one that is just as important, influential, with just the notoriety attached with him, is Masumi Akita, mostly known for being the man behind the project Merzbow. The key contributing factors that has led to his notoriety, success, and influence for noise is quite substantial, actually, because when you look at the fact that he's been active since essentially the Japanese noise scene started in the early 80s and has kept with it ever since, so to a lot of people he's considered to be an originator for it, along with the fact too that his discography is insane. Like, last time I checked, I think there's roughly around 400 releases under his belt, if not more, and it grows substantially every year. So he's always been just so on the, trigger releasing albums consistently. And a lot of those albums he's done collaborations with, which I do feel like helps get his name thrown around a lot more, especially in the metal scene, because I know he's done collaborations with Sun, Boris, and Full of Hell. And the latest collaboration that he's doing, which I know it's on the realms of metal, but I still think it's really cool that he's doing this, is that later on this year he's going to release a collab with Beat Me Manifesto, which from the preview track I've heard, it's just really crazy, obnoxious, kind of like breakbeat noise that, again, if you just like music with percussions that are obnoxious, abrasive, and hard-hitting, this might appeal to you from what I've heard of the preview, and I can't wait to hear the rest. When it comes to discussing what is the best album to start with in the Merzbow discography, a lot of people point towards Pulse Demon, which I would argue against that because this is a very just schizophrenic, abrasive, abstract noise album that really has no formula or structure to it. It's just abrasive, nonsensical noise that, again, has more of that improvisation kind of like mindset with it. And I feel like the reason as to why this album has so much notoriety and traction is more of the backstory with it, because this was originally released in, I believe, the mid-90s, and it wasn't put out through a label of like some abstract noise label. It was actually put out originally through Relapse Records, the same label, as most of you guys I'm sure know, puts out albums in the style of like death metal, grindcore, and sludge metal, and other forms of extreme metal, mainly known for being an extreme metal label. This was just so unheard of for its time, and what it did is when it was originally released, it was introduced to a whole new audience that really wasn't ready for a noise album. Thus, again, it has more traction from that. So I feel like if you're trying to get into Merzbow and, again, get a better understanding of noise music, the best album to start off with in his discography was actually released, I believe, in the early 2000s, called Merzbow. As you can kind of tell just by the album title, Merzbow is a lot more focused on percussions, composition with forms of psychedelic and breakbeat, that even though it runs for 50 minutes long, a good portion of it is really easy to follow along with, and actually quite engaging. Again, make no mistake about it, it's going to be abrasive, it's going to be very hectic with how the percussions are laid out, but again, there's just more of a familiar sense with how it's all being played out. Thus, I would recommend this is the best place to start off within the Merzbow discography, and just overall a really solid noise album to help you just understand what you're getting yourself into, basically. As I'm sure you're kind of aware at this point, I feel like to get someone into noise music, you need to find more of the rhythmic sense in noise. And another great album to check out that runs for nearly 4 hours long, so you'll definitely get your fill for it, is Alberich, NATO Uniform Men. Self-described by the individual behind this project, Chris Lapke, as heavy electronics, it's a mixture of drone, dark ambient, industrial, power electronics, and a multitude of other forms of electronic music, all combined together, that it's more of a slow burn. Again, this album runs for nearly 4 hours long, and there's a lot of minimalism and slow progressions being unfolded throughout it. That, yeah, it's definitely not the most eventful, but it's very easy to follow along with. That I feel like for people who just kind of want background music, you want an album to just fill up the space in an empty room, this album does have some really intriguing moments. Again, it kind of creates more of like this bleak, dark, and grim atmosphere while being minimal at the same time. I just feel like the compositions and overall sounds you get are very powerful just by the minimalism, and again, a really intriguing album, and I feel like another great gateway for this style of music. And if you're looking for even more rhythmic oriented noise that tends to be a bit more upbeat, I might add, then I would strongly recommend Dreamcrusher with the album Incinerator, which, even though these songs range from 7 to 8 minutes long, and I believe even the intro track runs for like roughly around 21 minutes long and then some, they are repetitive, yes, but they're really infectious because the percussions, as repetitive as they are easy to digest, And these slow progressions through the synthesizers that kind of like circle around these beats and percussions add a bit more of like this livened up feature to it. That, as weird as this sounds, I feel like this album kind of embodies the energy of what like a rave would be for noise artists and noise fans. It's like the feeling it has, because to be honest with you, out of everything I'm talking about, the most fun I had listening to a noise album would be this by Dreamcrusher. That it's just a really infectious noise album because of its percussions. That if you're looking for more upbeat and like percussion oriented noise, definitely check out some of Dreamcrusher's work. The next inclusion might be somewhat of a cheat, because it's not really labeled as a noise project or a power electronics project. If anything, it's more labeled in the realms of noise rock and punk rock with elements of noise. And I want to primarily focus on just noise artists with like no other subgenres attached with it. But I feel like I need to include these guys again if you're trying to get into noise and be more familiar with it. And that would be White Suns with their album Totem. Now, as I stated, they are a noise rock band, and they're not going to be labeled as like a power electronics or stuff like that. However, when you listen to how they play their instruments, it resembles the structure of noise so much that I feel like I just had to include it. Because yes, there are guitar, bass, and drums being played on this album, but they play it so violently and chaotically that these instruments that you're used to hearing in the traditional sense just sound like a whirlwind of razor blade static and noise, obviously, being cacophonated, that it's just really intense to listen to. However, with all of just these layers of static and reverb just, falling on top of each other, there's still like this little glimmer of like a punk band like in the middle of all of this mess. Thus, it makes it easier to follow along with and has more of that familiarity that you would expect. That it's like you're getting the, I guess, chaotic nature of punk, but the abrasive factor of noise like side by side here. And it's really mesmerizing as it is terrifying and powerful. And honestly, I had a blast listening to this album, whether or not you're a fan of punk or a fan of noise. It's a really intense and intriguing listen that, again, if you're trying to get into noise, definitely check out White Suns. Lastly, for the more accessible albums in this video, I would recommend Wolf Eyes with their album Burned Mind. Now, Wolf Eyes is a really intriguing project. Even though a bulk of their discography has to do in the realms of like abstract, abrasive noise that has a lot of improvisation to it, there are quite a handful of albums that dive more into realms of like ambient, dark ambient, and focus more on their composition aspect that is quite effective and unique. However, with the album Burned Mind, this is easily Wolf Eyes at their most unhinged and aggressive. Personally, I feel like it's important to point this out because when I hear the term extreme music, I know a lot of people think of extreme metal immediately because they kind of go hand in hand, both having the word extreme attached with it. But for me personally, extreme music also goes into the realms of noise, I feel like, mainly for it being so abstract, against the grain, and abrasive in nature. Thus, when you listen to this album and hear the vocals on it, it's so vile and throat-wrenching that it resembles a lot of the characteristics, at least to my ears, to that of the black metal vocals. And when you hear just the pulsating and nauseating noises coming through it, as odd as it is, there's kind of like, again, a sense of rhythm to follow along with that I feel like in terms of execution, this album resembles a lot of the energy of extreme metal, but it's done in the realms of power electronics. That if you're an extreme metal fan and you want noise to just be dense, unforgiving, relentless, and vicious while still carrying, like, again, the attitude of what you like in extreme metal, this album gives that energy off throughout its whole runtime. And as weird as this is to say about a noise album, it's highly enjoyable. As for the last three albums, I would state these are more in the intermediate levels of power electronics and noise music. That, again, if you feel adventurous and you really want to test your overall endurance with this style this early on, definitely check these out. But I do feel like overall, if you're trying to broaden your horizons and understand just the overall subculture of noise as a whole, these three are essentials and need to be talked about. Obviously, if I'm going to make a video about noise, it goes without question that I need to talk about by default Whitehouse, because their importance to the overall formation of noise and power electronics is significant to the highest degree. Basically, the best way I can summarize it is what Black Sabbath is to metal, Whitehouse is to power electronics. So much so that they coined the term in the late 80s to help separate themselves from really any other noise artist, because they truly felt like what they were creating during their time was vastly different from everything else. It goes without saying, but I'll just state it anyway for those who are unaware, Whitehouse are an extremely controversial project, having themes that are extremely perverse and just taboo-like in nature, that if you decided to go down an odyssey of Whitehouse releases, it's going to get messed up really quickly. But the album of theirs that's considered to be their magnum opus and debatably the best power electronics album ever made is Birdseed. And I feel like it has to do with the fact that the first 3 songs have a lot of bounce and aggression to them, that even though it's conducted in the sense of power electronics, when you hear William Bennett's screaming over all the noises and sounds, it resembles more of like this punk type of feeling with it. Not only is this album substantial for the fact that it's a Whitehouse record, but I feel like a huge reason as to why it appeals to so many noise fans is a factor that you really don't think about when talking about power electronics. And it all has to do, honestly, with the production value on this album is stellar. It's very dense, but at the same time, all the sharp noises you're hearing are easy to understand and make out. And the producer behind this album was Steve Albini. Steve Albini, being the same guy who produced the final Nirvana record, also produced this album, and I think that's just fucking wild. The other project that's just as important when talking about the formation of power electronics next to Whitehouse is Sutcliffe Jugen. Just like Whitehouse, Sutcliffe Jugen is very perverse and taboo-like with their lyrical content, that it can get downright disturbing at times. And for a lot of people that enjoy Sutcliffe Jugen, they tend to point towards their album We Spit on Their Graves as like their best works that they've done. Although I do admit this album is really overbearing for anyone who even tries to listen to it, as it's kind of like this album of a compilation of sorts that runs for nearly 10 hours long, that I feel like for anyone who even tries to pursue listening to this album from beginning to end mentally will be destroyed. Instead, I would suggest listening to the album when pornography is no longer enough. Not only because it isn't nearly 10 hours long like the previous album, and it roughly goes around 30 minutes at most, but I feel like the concept for it is a bit easier to digest. And even though I state that, just let it be known, by no means is this album easy on the ears. It's just pure power electronics is what this album embodies, really. The unhinged and just really uncontrollable screams that go off throughout this album kind of reflects more on like the ideas of withdrawals and not really getting your fix. As if this album's kind of like a manifestation of just someone mentally breaking down, and every little aspect about it, from the noises, transitions, textures, and screaming, is a representation of that moment happening, is what I get from this album. And again, I do feel like it's a good representation of what you're getting yourself into if you start going more on the deep end of power electronics. Final album for this video, and easily the most pulverizing and brutal out of everything here, goes to Deathpile with their final full-length album, GR, which is the initials for the Green River Killer known as Gary Ridgway. The concept for this album is it all has to do with dealing with the perspective of Gary Ridgway himself, a convicted serial killer that I believe was convicted of 49 murders from what I read, and is suspected of committing almost over 70 murders, if not more. One might say that looking at this at face value, that it's done in a distasteful way, almost in the sense that we're glorifying this serial killer, when in actuality I do feel like it's done with maturity, respect, and a tasteful sense, because again, it's his perspective, and it's more of this narrative sense to give you an idea of what a serial killer might think and do. That yeah, when I listen to this album and hear all the noises and textures and compositions, abrasive static that goes off, to all of just the schizophrenic like sounds that come in and out from the vocals and audio samples, I feel disturbed, I feel gross, I can feel my stomach turn inside out, and this emotional reaction I get from it, which I feel like this album is trying to implore, that's what makes it tasteful. That's what makes it feel mature, that this is a very despicable individual, and thus we should have an album that kind of like portrays that, and we shouldn't be afraid to make art like this. So I do feel like it's very ambitious in of itself to even explore this kind of territory onto any form of music or noise. I do feel like with the context attached with the album, which is impossible to ignore, because to even know of this album, I do feel like it becomes inescapable to also talk about the context with it. It's just a really disturbing piece of work in every aspect. And again, it's not an album I would recommend if you're trying to just get into noise, but for anyone who's adventurous, who really even wants to test themselves, I really feel like to the limit, again, when getting into noise music, this is like a really substantial album in every aspect in terms of the emotions, the context, the sounds, that, again, it's definitely not for everyone, but I feel like it's another essential when you start getting not only to the deeper parts of noise, but just experiencing and knowing what noise is really all about. Again, this is another album that embodies it in every which way possible. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be down below in the description. Really curious to know what are some noise albums you would recommend to someone who is new to it. And yeah, that is that. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.